The sun has slipped low enough now that the harbor water turns the color of hammered pewter, and the ship, which only hours ago strained forward with her sails full of wind and purpose, settles into something quieter, something that asks for a different kind of attention. She rocks gently at her anchor, no longer racing the horizon, but she is far from asleep. There is a peculiar kind of stillness that falls over a vessel once she has found her resting place for the night, whether that be a quiet roadstead beyond a headland or a crowded dock lined with the masts of other ships waiting their turn. The stillness is real, but it is not empty. It is the stillness of a held breath rather than a finished one, the pause between labors rather than the absence of labor altogether. Anchoring a ship does not conclude her day. It merely reshapes it, folding the wide, exhausting choreography of sailing into something smaller, more deliberate, and in its own way just as necessary. Think for a moment of what the day has asked of her crew. Hours spent hauling on lines that bit into palms, adjusting canvas to catch or spill the wind, watching the sky for signs of weather that might turn a playful breeze into something less forgiving. All of that has ended, at least for now, and yet the ship herself has not stopped needing tending. She is a living structure of rope and timber and iron, and like anything alive, she requires care even in her rest. The crew understands this instinctively, the way a shepherd understands that a flock brought safely into the fold still needs watching through the night. So the watches are set. This is the quiet architecture beneath the visible calm, the invisible scaffolding that holds a harbored ship together through the dark hours. Some number of men, fewer than would be needed at sea, are assigned to remain alert while others sink into whatever rest they can find below deck or in whatever corner of the dock offers a bed for the night. The watch is not merely a formality inherited from tradition, though tradition plays its part. It is a genuine necessity, for harbors are not as safe as they might appear from a distance, glittering with lantern light and looking so serene. A harbor at dusk holds its own quiet dangers, subtler than the open seas but no less real. Other vessels move nearby, some still finding their moorings, and a drifting hull can be pushed by tide or wind into unwanted contact with its neighbors if no one is minding the lines. Thieves have been known to slip along the waterline in the dark, drawn by the promise of unattended cargo or careless crews, and there is always the simple matter of weather, which does not observe the courtesy of staying calm just because a ship has anchored. A sudden squall can test even a well-set anchor, and a watch asleep at his post might not notice until the strain has already begun to tell on the cable. So the men on watch move through their tasks with a rhythm that feels almost like a hushed liturgy, if a rough and practical one. Lamps are checked first, for light is the language a harbored ship speaks to the world around her, a way of saying, I am here, mind your course, keep your distance. The oil is topped if it needs it, the wicks trimmed, the glass wiped free of the salt film that gathers with surprising speed even in still air. A dim lamp is worse than no lamp at all, for it invites confidence where caution is due, and so this small chore, easily overlooked, is treated with the seriousness it deserves. Then come the ropes, coiled and recoiled, not because they were done wrongly the first time, but because a rope left in disarray on deck becomes a hazard in the dark, something to trip over or tangle in when speed might matter. There's a particular satisfaction, the old hands say, in a properly coiled line, the kind of quiet pride that has nothing to do with anyone watching and everything to do with a job simply done well. The coils sit like sleeping snakes along the rail, ready to be seized and run out again the moment they're needed, whether that moment comes at dawn or in some unexpected emergency before then. The anchor cable itself receives attention too, a careful eye run along its length where it disappears into the darkening water. Chafe is the quiet enemy here, the slow abrasion that comes from rope rubbing against wood or stone with the endless small movements of a ship at rest. A cable that seems secure at sunset can fray in ways invisible to a casual glance, and so the watch checks it, feels it, sometimes even eases it slightly to shift the point of wear before it becomes a genuine weakness. This is not dramatic work. It rarely produces a story worth telling at a tavern later, but it is the kind of unglamorous vigilance that keeps ships from becoming disasters, the sort of care that history mostly forgets to mention because nothing went wrong. All around this quiet labor, the harbor itself makes its evening sounds, layered and soft, entirely its own kind of music. Water taps against the hull with a rhythm that never quite repeats itself, sometimes a gentle lapping, sometimes a slightly firmer knock as some unseen current shifts beneath the surface. It's a sound that becomes, after enough nights, almost invisible to the ear, absorbed into the background the way a heartbeat is absorbed into the awareness of one's own body. And yet, if you listen for it, truly listen, it carries a strange comfort, proof that the ship still floats, still breathes with the water around her. From somewhere on shore, indistinct but unmistakably human, comes the occasional shout, a dockworker calling to another, a merchant closing up his stall for the evening, perhaps a child being called home to supper before the light fails entirely. These sounds drift across the water, changed by distance, softened at their edges, arriving not as words so much as gestures of human presence, small reminders that the harbor is a place where land and sea overlap, where the busy, ordinary world continues even as the ship rests apart from it. A pulley somewhere aloft settles with a small creak, the kind of sound that would alarm a landsman but means nothing at all to ears trained by months or years at sea. It's simply the rigging finding its equilibrium, the rope and wood adjusting to the gentle rocking of the hull, the way an old house settles at night with small pops and sighs that mean nothing more than wood remembering the day's warmth as it cools. Above, if the sky is clear, the first stars might be visible now, indifferent and steady, offering no comment on the small dramas playing out below them on deck and dock alike. A footstep sounds on the planking, unhurried, the particular gait of someone walking a watch rather than rushing towards some task. There is a way of moving on a ship at anchor that differs subtly from moving on a ship underway. At sea, footsteps carry urgency even when unhurried, always aware of the ship's motion, always braced against a possible lurch. At anchor, footsteps can afford a small looseness, a slight indulgence in the stillness, though never so much as to forget that vigilance is still the purpose being served. The watch walks his rounds not because he expects trouble, but because expecting it is precisely how trouble is prevented. Below deck, in whatever space serves as quarters, the off-watch crew settles into whatever rest the ship allows. Some sleep easily, worn down by the day's labor into a heaviness that welcomes even a narrow bunk and a thin blanket. Others lie awake a while longer, listening to the same sounds the watch above is attending to, though with less purpose, simply absorbing the familiar noise of a resting ship the way one might absorb rain on a roof. There's comfort in it, this shared listening, even for those not formally on duty. A ship's crew learns quickly that safety is communal, that even sleep participates in a kind of vigilance simply by trusting the watch to do its work. The cook, if he has finished his duties for the evening, might sit for a moment near his banked fire, letting its last warmth fade before he too seeks rest, thinking ahead perhaps to what the morning's meal will require, what stores remain, what might need replenishing before the ship sails again. Even in stillness, minds aboard a ship tend toward the practical, toward tomorrow's necessities, for a harbor night is never truly separate from the voyages that came before or the ones still to come. The ship exists always in a kind of continuum, past sailing bleeding into future sailing, with these anchored hours serving as the quiet seam between them. It would be a mistake, then, to think of this harbor evening as an ending. It is closer to a long exhale after exertion, necessary and restorative, but not truly a stopping point. The vessel remains, in every meaningful sense, alive, her ropes still capable of chafing, her lamps still needing oil, her hull still vulnerable to drift and current and the careless swing of another ship's stern. The obligations of the sea have not vanished simply because the sails are furled. They have only changed their shape, becoming smaller, more repetitive, easier to overlook, precisely because they lack the drama of a storm or the triumph of a safe arrival. This is the quiet truth beneath so much of maritime life. one that the more dramatic tales of storms and battles and daring passages tend to leave out. A ship spends far more of her existence in this state of watchful rest than she does in the full flight of sailing, and the people who tend her during these hours deserve, in their own understated way, just as much attention as the ones who once hauled her through gales. Their work does not announce itself, it simply continues, night after night, the invisible discipline that makes the more visible dramas possible at all. This is as the last light fades entirely from the sky and the harbor settles into its fuller darkness, the watch continues its rounds, the lamps burn on, the ropes lie coiled and ready, and the ship rests in that peculiar state of being simultaneously still and utterly awake. It is here, in this careful listening rather than sailing, that we begin to understand what a harbored ship actually does with her nights, not sleeping, not truly, but attending, in her own patient way, to the small vigilant work that makes tomorrow's voyage possible, and it is to that first watch, standing quietly between the darkness and the deck, that we turn next. So let the ship rest a little longer in that stillness we have just described, for it is out of exactly this stillness that the first watch quietly rises, taking up its post as though summoned by nothing more than habit and necessity. There is no ceremony to it, no drum roll of importance, no lantern held aloft to mark the changing of duty. A sailor simply steps forward when his turn comes, perhaps rubbing sleep from his eyes, perhaps already half awake from the low murmur of the harbor itself, and takes up the long, patient work of paying attention when nothing on the surface seems to be happening at all. It is a strange kind of labor, this standing watch, one that produces no visible result and leaves no mark upon the ship, and yet without it, everything else the ship depends upon would slowly come undone. It would be easy to imagine that a ship at anchor requires no watching whatsoever, that once the sails are furled and the anchor is down, the vessel simply waits, inert, for morning, the way a cart might wait in a barn until it is needed again. But those who have spent their lives at sea know better, and they would tell you, if asked, that an anchored ship is very much alive to her surroundings, and dangerously so if left unattended. Tides shift beneath the hull without asking permission, working their slow, invisible pressure against wood and iron alike. Wind can swing round in the night and catch a ship broadside, tugging at her cable in ways that test both rope and anchor, sometimes gently, sometimes with a suddenness that startles even a seasoned sleeper awake. A vessel can drift if her anchor drags along a soft or uncertain bottom, feeling its way loose without anyone above the water quite noticing until the motion has already begun. Or she can swing on her cable, slow and unhurried, until she finds herself uncomfortably close to a neighbor she had no intention of visiting. In crowded harbors especially, where dozens of ships might lie at anchor within calling distance of one another, the possibility of drifting into another hull, of fouling another vessel's cable with your own, was no small matter. It could mean torn rigging, splintered wood, furious words exchanged across dark water, or, in the unluckiest of circumstances, something worse still. And so someone had to watch, all through the night, for the subtle signs that trouble might be brewing, long before it ever announced itself plainly. The watch itself was rarely a dramatic affair, at least not in the way that word might suggest to those unfamiliar with its rhythms. It was, more than anything, an exercise in listening, a discipline of the ear as much as the eye. A sailor's standing watch would learn to hear the harbor the way a shepherd learns to hear his flock, picking out from the general hush the particular sounds that meant something worth noting, and letting the rest simply pass over him like the tide itself. The creak of the ship's own spars, for instance, had its own vocabulary, an almost conversational back and forth between wood and rope and wind that a practiced ear came to recognize as ordinary, comforting even, unless it changed pitch or urgency in a way that suggested strain. The anchor cable, too, had its voice, a low groan or a sudden jerk transmitted up through the deck that told the watchers something about how the ship was riding, whether she sat easy on her road, or whether the current was beginning to test her in ways that wanted checking, and perhaps a firmer hand. Beyond the ship herself, The wider harbor offered its own quiet symphony, and part of the watch's skill lay in distinguishing the ordinary night sounds from anything that might signal change. A bell buoy, if the harbor kept one, tolled with the movement of the swell, its rhythm as familiar and unremarkable as a heartbeat, until perhaps a shift in the wind altered its cadence, just enough to catch a watchful ear and set it wondering. Lights on the water told their own quiet story as well. The lanterns hung from other anchored vessels rocked gently with each ship's motion, and a sailor who had spent enough nights watching learned to read those small bobbing lights the way a reader follows lines of familiar text, noticing when one seemed to swing wider than it should, when a light that had sat steady off the starboard bow began, ever so slowly, to drift toward the bow itself. Such small observations, made and remade through the long hours, were the entire substance of the watch's labor. Nothing needed to happen for the watch to matter. Its value lay precisely in noticing when something, however small, had only just begun to. There was, too, a social dimension to the harbor at night that the watch had to attend to, for a crowded anchorage was as much a small floating village as it was a collection of separate vessels, and villages, as anyone knows, have their disputes. Arguments over anchorage were not uncommon, particularly in busy ports where space was tight and every captain believed his position deserved priority over his neighbors. A ship arriving late in the day might find that the spot she had intended to take was already occupied, or that another vessel's cable had been laid out in a way that threatened to cross her own once the tide turned and the currents shifted their allegiance. Voices might carry across the water in the hush of evening, sharp with the particular indignation of men who felt their rights of anchorage had been slighted, and the watch, hearing this, would take careful note of where the trouble lay, ready to wake the mate or captain if matters seemed likely to worsen in the dark hours when tempers, unfortunately, did not always cool as quickly as the air around them. More often, though, such disputes settled themselves into grudging tolerance by nightfall, the parties agreeing, however reluctantly, to share the water they had both claimed, and the watch's task returned to its ordinary business of simply keeping track of who lay where, and how close was, in truth, too close for comfort. It is worth pausing here, gently, on the older beliefs that some sailors carried with them into these long night watches, beliefs that have mostly faded now, but were once woven quietly into the fabric of harbor life. Sailors have never been strangers to superstition, and the anchored ship at night, caught in that strange suspended hour between motion and rest, seemed to invite a particular kind of folklore all its own. Some believed that harbors held their own spirits, unseen presences tied to the water itself, who took a certain interest in the ships that rested within their bounds, watching as closely as the sailors watched them. A sudden unexplained creak or a light that seemed to flicker without cause might be attributed, half in jest and half in earnest, to such a presence taking notice of the vessel, perhaps testing her, perhaps merely passing by. Other sailors held that the behavior of gulls or other birds near an anchorage after dark carried some meaning about the weather to come, an omen worth watching for, even if no one could quite say how the belief had first taken root or why it had lasted so long. These notions were never taken as certainty even by the sailors who repeated them, and it would be a mistake to imagine an entire crew nodding solemnly at the mention of harbor spirits as though reciting a creed. They were, rather, the kind of tale passed along in low voices during a long watch, half comfort and half amusement, a way of giving shape to the unknown quiet of the night without pretending to explain it fully or claim more than it could rightly hold. Whether such beliefs held any truth is not for us to say, only that they existed, and that they added their own quiet color to the long hours of listening, the way a familiar song might color a long walk home. Beneath these stories, though, the actual work of the watch remained steady and practical, built around a set of checks repeated so often that they became a kind of quiet ritual in themselves, worn smooth by repetition, the way a stair is worn smooth by footsteps. The watch would move along the deck at intervals, checking the tension of the anchor cable where it disappeared into the dark water, feeling with a hand, or even, in some cases, listening with an ear pressed close to gauge whether the strain had changed since his last passing. He would glance toward the ship's riding light, making certain it burned clear and steady, for a dimmed or extinguished light was more than a matter of tidiness. It was how other vessels, moving in the darkness on their own quiet errands, knew where this ship lay and steered wide of her. He would look to the sky as well, not out of idle curiosity, but because clouds moving against the stars, or a sudden hush in a breeze that had been steady all evening, could mean a shift in weather worth reporting, a change that might call for hauling in more cable or paying out a bit more scope, depending on how the wind seemed inclined to behave before morning. None of these checks took very long individually. It was their constant repetition, hour after hour, that gave them their real value. For a single glance at a cable tells you little on its own, but a glance repeated every quarter hour across a night begins, quite gradually, to tell you a great deal about how a ship is truly riding through the dark. The passage of time itself was marked in these hours by the ship's bell, struck at intervals to divide the watch into its recognizable portions, each strike a small punctuation in the long, unhurried sentence of the night. A sailor coming off watch might exchange only a few words with the one relieving him, a brief accounting of the wind's behavior, the state of the cable, whatever small matters seemed worth passing along before sleep claimed him, and then the fresh watch would settle into the same patient posture his predecessor had held, picking up the thread of attention exactly where it had been set down, as though it had never been interrupted at all. There was a comfort in this continuity, an unspoken understanding that the watch was never truly alone in his task, that he stood in a long, unbroken chain of others who had done precisely this, on precisely such nights, for as long as ships had been built to anchor rather than simply run aground when their sailing was done for the season. And if the night grew long, as it always did, there were smaller comforts to be found in the sheer familiarity of the harbor itself. A watch who had stood his post in the same anchorage over several nights running came to know its particular character, the way one comes to know a familiar room in darkness, able to move through it by memory and feel rather than sight. He knew which light belonged to which vessel, which creek was simply his own ship settling, and which might belong to a neighbor shifting on her cable somewhere off in the dark. He knew, too, the general hush that settled over a harbor in its deepest hours, when even the most restless of ships seemed to quiet at last, and how that hush might be broken, gently, by the distant call of another watch confirming all was well, a small exchange of voices carried across the water that reassured everyone involved that the harbor as a whole remained undisturbed and unthreatened. There is something quietly moving in this if one allows oneself to notice it. An entire community of watchers, stationed on separate decks, none of them acquainted particularly well, all engaged nonetheless in the same silent labor of attention, bound together by nothing more than the shared understanding that someone on every ship must remain awake so that everyone else might safely sleep through until dawn. By the time the sky begins its first faint softening toward morning, the watch will have made his rounds more times than he could easily count, each check nearly identical to the last, each repetition its own small act of care rendered so quietly that it might almost be mistaken for nothing at all happening. Yet it is precisely this unremarkable vigilance, hour upon patient hour, that carries a ship safely through her hours of rest and hands her over, unharmed and unfouled, to the demands of a new day waiting just beyond the horizon. And as that day begins to stir, the watch's task will shift almost imperceptibly into something else entirely, for the same steady hands that tended cable and lantern through the dark will soon turn themselves toward rope and canvas, toward the small, quiet repairs that morning always seems to ask for, and it is there, among coils and needles and the first honest light on deck, that we will follow them next. So let the lantern dim now, and let the watch's tired eyes rest a little easier, for the sky has begun that slow, unhurried brightening that sailors learn to trust long before they can name the hour by it. There is no sudden change, no bell struck twice as loud, only a softening at the edge of the horizon, as though night itself were exhaling one long, quiet breath before giving way. And it is into this pale, uncertain light that the ship begins to wake, not with urgency, but with the particular calm of a body that knows its own rhythms well enough not to rush them. The same hands that held the lantern through darkness now find themselves reaching instead for coils of rope, for canvas folded in patient stacks, for the small tools that have waited all night in their worn leather pouches, as if even the tools themselves understood that their hour was coming. This is the hour of quiet mending, though no one would call it dramatic work, and no one watching from shore would think to remark on it at all. It begins as so much aboard a ship begins, with simply looking, an unhurried walk along the deck, eyes moving upward along the standing rigging, tracing each line from block to cleat, searching not for disaster, but for its faint early whispers. A sailor learns to read rope the way another might read a familiar face, noticing not what has changed dramatically, but what has shifted subtly, a slight fraying where a shroud rubs against a spar, a softness in fiber that once held firm, a place where salt and sun have begun ever so slowly to work their quiet erosion. Nothing here announces itself loudly, it only waits to be noticed, and so noticing becomes its own kind of devotion, practiced morning after morning until it feels less like inspection than habit, less like duty than simple care. Hemp rope, when it is still sound, has a particular feel beneath the fingers, firm, slightly rough, faintly oily from the tar worked into it during its making, and warm where the early sun has begun to touch it. A sailor's hands, roughened themselves by years of exactly this kind of handling, move along its length almost without thinking, feeling for irregularities the way one might feel for a splinter half hidden in a familiar plank of wood. When a frayed section is found, there is no alarm in the discovery, only the quiet acknowledgement that here is a small piece of work waiting to be done, and that it is far better done now, in calm light and stillness, than left for some far less forgiving storm to expose later on. And so the sailor settles, often cross-legged upon the deck or braced comfortably against a rail, and begins the familiar, unhurried work of splicing. Splicing is a task that rewards patience more than strength, and it is one of those skills that becomes almost meditative once the hands have learned it well enough to move without conscious thought guiding every motion. 3 strands are separated gently from the rope's end, teased apart with careful fingers or the flat, blunt edge of a marlinspike, and then woven back through the body of the rope in a pattern so old that no one aboard could say with certainty when or where it was first devised, only that it had been passed down, hand to hand, long before any of them had learned it themselves, over, under, pulled snug, and again, each pass tightening the joint until what was frayed and vulnerable becomes once more something whole and trustworthy. There is a particular satisfaction in watching a splice come together, in feeling the rope regain its strength beneath one's palms, as though a small wound had simply closed itself through nothing more than steady attention. The finished splice is often no more elegant to look at than the rope surrounding it, and that, in its own quiet way, is the very point of it. It should disappear back into its ordinary duty, unremarkable and unnoticed, doing its work faithfully for months or years to come, without ever calling attention to itself again. The smell of tar drifts through all of this work, mingling with salt air and the particular scent of sun-warmed hemp, a combination so constant aboard ship that sailors likely stopped noticing it long ago, the way one stops noticing the smell of one's own home after enough years spent within its walls. Tar was worked into rope not merely for strength but for protection, sealing out the moisture that might otherwise rot the fibers slowly from within, and so part of the morning's labor often involved touching up these tarred sections wherever wear had thinned the coating past its usefulness. A small pot warmed gently over a low flame, and a brush worn soft from years of use. These were enough to renew a section of standing rigging, the dark, sticky substance worked carefully into the fibers with the same unhurried attention given earlier to the splicing itself. It was not glamorous work by any measure. It left hands stained black for days afterward, the smell clinging faintly to clothing and skin alike, following a sailor even into sleep. But it was necessary, and necessity aboard a ship tends to wear the quiet dignity of routine rather than the drama of emergency, asking only to be attended to, not admired. While some hands tended the rigging, others turned their attention toward canvas, for sails, too, demanded the same careful, unglamorous vigilance. A sail that has weathered even a single hard blow might carry within its folds small tears invisible from any distance, seams strained just slightly beyond their intended tension, patches worn thin where wind and salt spray have done their slow, patient work of erosion. The morning light, gentle as it was, proved especially useful for this inspection, precisely because of its gentleness, strong enough to reveal flaws honestly, soft enough not to glare harshly off pale canvas and tire the eyes too quickly before the work was even done. Sailors would often spread a sail across the deck or hold sections of it up toward the brightening sky, searching for thin places where light passed through too easily, for threads pulled loose from their weave, for the telltale puckering that suggested a seam beginning to strain against itself. Repairing sailcloth required its own particular tools, humble as they were in appearance: a sailmaker's needle, thick and strong enough to pierce heavy canvas without bending, and a leather palm strapped firmly across the hand to push that needle through material far too stubborn for fingers alone to manage. The thread itself was often waxed, drawn slowly across a small block of beeswax before use, so that it might resist moisture and slide more smoothly through the tightly woven fabric, leaving behind stitches meant to hold fast against wind that could otherwise tear a poorly mended seam apart within hours of setting sail again. There is something almost domestic in the image of a sailor bent low over torn canvas with needle and palm, working patiently stitch by stitch, the same unhurried rhythm one might find in any quiet household task performed by firelight on a winter evening ashore. And indeed, this comparison would not have felt strange to the sailors themselves, for so much of shipboard life balanced precariously between the rough demands of open sea and small, careful acts of domestic maintenance that kept the whole fragile system quietly functioning beneath it. A patch, once cut to size from spare canvas kept folded away for exactly this purpose, would be laid carefully over the damaged section, its edges turned under slightly to prevent fraying, and then stitched into place with the same even, deliberate motion used earlier in splicing rope, over, through, pulled taut, and again, until the rhythm of the needle became almost its own kind of breathing. The work was slow by necessity, and rightly so. Canvas that received a hurried patch, stitched too loosely or with thread not properly waxed against moisture, might fail again within days, undoing hours of careful labor and leaving a sailor to repeat work that patience alone might have spared entirely. And so the ethos aboard ship, in this quiet hour of morning mending, was one that valued thoroughness over speed, correctness over convenience, understanding implicitly that the sea would eventually test every shortcut and rarely forgive the ones who dared to take them. Lashings, too, received their fair share of attention during these unhurried morning hours. The countless small bindings that held barrels steady against a bulkhead, secured spare timber safely along the rail, or kept coils of extra rope from working themselves loose amid the ship's constant, restless motion. These lashings wore just as rope did, weakened by salt and strain and the endless small stresses of a vessel that never truly stood still, even at anchor in the calmest of harbors. A sailor checking these bindings might find one gone slightly slack, the knot beginning to loosen its patient grip, and would simply retie it, testing the new knot's firmness with a firm, practiced tug before moving quietly on to the next. There was no ceremony in this at all. It was simply the kind of thing that needed doing, done precisely because doing it now cost so little compared to the consequences of leaving it undone until some later, far less convenient moment when wind or wave might expose the failure with considerably less mercy. What strikes one most, thinking of these mornings now, is how little any of this resembled the sailing life as it is often imagined, all storm and daring, sails straining hard against wind, the drama of open water beneath a ship pressed forward on her course toward some distant, uncertain shore. The truth, at anchor especially, was quieter than that, built instead from countless small acts of maintenance performed by patient hands long before any storm ever arrived to test their worth. A ship's readiness was not forged in some single dramatic moment of crisis, but assembled instead from mornings exactly like this one: rope inspected, splices made, tar reapplied, canvas patched, lashings retied, each small task unremarkable entirely on its own, yet together forming the quiet foundation upon which everything else, the sailing, the surviving, the safe arrival at some distant harbor months or years away, ultimately depended without anyone aboard ever needing to say so aloud. There was a rhythm to it, too, one that repeated itself morning after morning, with only minor variation, and sailors moved through this rhythm with the ease of long familiarity, hands finding their tools without needing to look, eyes scanning rigging almost automatically after years of practiced, patient attention. A newer hand might work more slowly still, learning gradually to feel the difference between rope merely weathered and rope truly weakened, learning the particular tension a splice should hold before it could be trusted with real weight. But even this learning happened quietly, through repetition rather than instruction, through the simple accumulation of mornings spent doing exactly this kind of careful work, alongside those who had done it far longer and no longer needed to think about it at all. By the time the sun had risen fully clear of the horizon, casting its full light across a deck now smelling faintly of tar and salt and sun-warmed hemp, much of this small labor would already be finished, tucked away again into the ordinary rhythm of the ship's day. Coils of rope, freshly spliced where needed, would hang once more in their proper places, indistinguishable to any passing eye from rope that had never frayed at all. Patched sails would be folded and stowed, or left ready should the wind call for their use before evening. Lashings freshly tightened would hold their cargo steady against whatever motion the day ahead might bring, and the sailors themselves, having spent this quiet hour bent over needle and rope and canvas, would straighten slowly, perhaps rubbing at sore fingers or stretching backs grown stiff from careful hunched labor, before turning their attention toward whatever task the ship's routine called for next. And it is here, in this natural pause between one small labor finished and another about to begin, that the ship's needs turn from rope and canvas towards something equally quiet, but perhaps even more essential to everyone aboard, toward the barrels stowed deep within her hold, and the careful, patient arithmetic that kept a crew fed and steady through however many weeks or months still lay waiting ahead. So let the hands rest a moment longer, and let the mind drift downward now, past the deck and the coiled rope and the newly mended sail, down into the cooler dark of the hold, where the ship kept her quieter secrets. For a vessel at anchor was never only a machine built for catching wind. She was, in her patient way, also a kind of floating pantry, a storehouse balanced upon water, and every soul aboard depended entirely on what had been packed into her belly weeks or even months before. Once the ropes were coiled and the canvas folded neatly away, it was only natural that attention would begin to turn downward, toward the barrels and sacks and jars that made up the ship's quiet, ongoing arithmetic of survival. There is something almost tender in imagining a sailor descending into that dim space, lantern swinging gently from one hand, the air thick with the mingled smell of tar, brine, and old salted wood. Down there, rows of casks stood shoulder to shoulder like patient old companions, each one holding some promise of the weeks still to come. Water for drinking, salted meat for strength, biscuit baked hard enough to survive a voyage twice as long as the one actually ahead. To open one of these barrels was never a careless act. It was done slowly, almost respectfully, for a ship's stores were not simply cargo to be shifted about. They were time itself, measured out in weight and volume, in the quiet, careful counting of what remained against what would still be needed before land came into view again. Biscuit, that humble food of the sea, required its own particular attention. It was dry and hard by design, meant to resist the damp that crept into every corner of a wooden hull, no matter how tightly she was caulked. But even biscuit had its limits. A sailor sorting through a barrel might find some pieces perfectly sound, others softened by lingering moisture, and occasionally, spoken of more with weary resignation than any real alarm, a piece marked by the small, persistent presence of weevils. This was treated less as calamity and more as an old, familiar nuisance, one of the quiet costs of feeding a crew across open water for weeks on end. The good pieces would be set carefully aside, the questionable ones dealt with according to long habit and plain necessity, and the barrel resealed once more against the air that always seemed eager to soften whatever should have stayed dry. Salt meat asked for a different kind of patience altogether. Pulled from its brine, it needed to be checked for color and for smell, for those faint, subtle signs that told an experienced hand whether it remained fit for the pot or whether it had begun, in some small, quiet way, to turn against them. Barrels were often shifted and rotated so that the oldest stores were used before the newer ones were touched at all, a practice as old as provisioning itself, born not from any written rule, but from the plain, unspoken logic of never letting good food spoil, while poorer food sat waiting untouched nearby. It was a rhythm every sailor eventually learned by feel rather than by instruction, in much the same way one learns, over time, to sense a coming change in the weather long before the sky confirms it. Dried peas, too, had their modest place within this careful accounting. Poured from their sacks into smaller containers meant for the day's use, they were checked for dampness, for that telltale clumping which suggested moisture had found some hidden way in, despite every precaution taken against it. A cook or steward might run a hand slowly through them, feeling for the faint stickiness that meant trouble was brewing, and if all still seemed well, a portion would be set aside for the next meal, while the rest was tied off and returned once more to its place in the hold's dim, patient order. Water, of course, remained the most solemn of all the ship's stores, for while food might be stretched, substituted, or endured in leaner form, water could never be replaced by wish or hope alone. Casks of it were inspected with particular seriousness, tapped gently to judge how full they still remained, checked for the taste and smell that might quietly signal spoilage or contamination creeping in unseen. A ship's carpenter or some other experienced hand often took charge of this task, moving from cask to cask with quiet, unhurried focus, marking tallies not only upon paper, but sometimes simply in memory, in that private ledger of long experience which told him how many days of comfortable use likely remained, and how many days of caution might follow soon after. Oil and vinegar, smaller in quantity but no less important to daily life aboard, sat tucked in their own corners of the hold, guarded almost jealously against breakage. Oil fed the lamps that would later guide hands through night watches and through dark corners below decks. Vinegar served both kitchen and cleanliness alike, its sharp scent sometimes drifting faintly up through open hatches as casks were checked or gently adjusted in their moorings. These smaller stores required less frequent attention than the great barrels of water or biscuit, yet their loss, however small it might seem at first, could ripple outward into far larger inconvenience later, and so they too were counted, however briefly, within the same quiet tally that kept the ship's days feeling steady and orderly. And tucked among all these provisions, often set apart in separate compartments or lockers, sat the trade goods, bolts of cloth, tools, small manufactured items, sometimes tobacco or drink meant for exchange in ports still unseen and unnamed. These were treated with a different sort of care, less concerned with spoilage and more with simple protection from damp, from pilferage, from the slow, constant wear of endless motion. A sailor tallying these particular goods worked almost like a quiet merchant standing in candlelight, noting quantities carefully, checking that nothing had shifted or split open during the last stretch of rough water, making certain that whatever had been promised to some distant buyer still waited, whole and ready, in the dark stillness below. They were just anchored. When the reeling demanded the street had suppressed almost 2 million, all of this labor, however humble it might appear, demanded real and considerable physical effort, both strength and a careful, practiced sense of balance, especially within a hold where footing remained uneven and the light stayed thin and scarce. Sailors often worked in pairs, guiding heavy casks along makeshift skids, easing them gently into new positions so that weight remained evenly distributed and nothing might shift dangerously once the ship herself began to move again upon open water. Stacking, too, carried its own quiet skill, barrels arranged not merely for convenience, but for balance, so that the ship would sit steady and even in the water, her cargo settled like some sleeping creature rather than something restless and prone to sliding in the night. And amid all this steady lifting and careful stacking came the tallying, that slow, endless, patient counting which gave real shape to the whole quiet task. A steward or an officer might move through the hold with a slate or a worn ledger in hand, marking down what remained of each store, comparing it against figures recorded before, calculating, sometimes with quiet worry, sometimes with simple, modest satisfaction, how many days the current stock might reasonably still last. It was not glamorous work, and it rarely produced a story worth telling later in some crowded tavern, but it remained, in its own understated way, one of the most essential tasks carried out aboard any ship, for a vessel that ran short of food or water far from land faced dangers that no amount of skilled sailing could easily undo. Airing the hold was another quiet ritual bound up closely with this same work. Hatches might be opened whenever weather allowed, letting fresh air move slowly through the dim, closed spaces where moisture so easily liked to gather and settle. Lanterns were watched with particular care during these moments, for open flame near stored goods was never taken lightly by any sensible crew, and the sailors moved through this task with the same unhurried caution that marked so much of shipboard life in general. The goal was never urgency, but steadiness, a slow, patient exchange of stale air for fresh, a small effort meant to keep dampness and its quiet companions of rot and mildew from settling too comfortably into the wood around them. Pests, too, remained an old and familiar concern, spoken of without great alarm, but never entirely dismissed either. Rats found their way aboard more often than any sailor truly wished, and small insects sometimes traveled unnoticed within sacks of grain or biscuit, hidden from sight until the moment a hand reached in and found them. Crews developed their own quiet strategies against these unwelcome passengers: careful storage, the occasional trap set in some dark corner, and the watchful presence of a ship's cat prowling the dim spaces of the hold with unhurried, confident patience. It was never a battle fought with any real drama, but rather a slow, ongoing negotiation, one more thread woven into the fabric of daily upkeep that never truly ended so long as a ship remained afloat upon the water. And through all of this quiet labor, there ran an unspoken respect for the arithmetic of survival itself. A crew did not simply eat because food happened to exist somewhere in the hold. They ate because someone, quietly and without any fanfare, had counted, checked, rotated, and preserved what had been loaded aboard weeks or months earlier. Every meal served at the ship's table was the visible end of an invisible chain of careful, patient labor. Barrels opened at just the right moment, meat rotated before it could spoil, water measured carefully against the uncertain length of the voyage still ahead. It was a form of care that asked for no praise and mostly received none at all, and yet without it, no sail, however cleverly trimmed, no course, however skillfully charted, could ever hope to carry a crew safely across open water for long. There is a kind of gentle irony worth pausing over here, if one allows the mind to settle on it a little, that a ship built entirely to move, to cross vast and unmarked distances of open sea, depended so heavily on labor that had nothing whatsoever to do with wind or wave. The same hands that hauled rope and adjusted rigging also lifted heavy barrels, checked biscuit for dampness, and counted casks of water with quiet, unhurried focus. The sea asked for skill and courage, certainly, and no one doubted that, but it asked just as much, in its own patient way, for the humble, repetitive discipline of good housekeeping, carried out far from any shore, in the swaying dark of a ship's hold. And so the hold, once checked and resettled, would fall quiet again, its barrels standing once more in their careful, patient rows, its sacks retied, its air a little fresher than before the hatches had been opened, the tally recorded, the small worries noted and gently set aside for another day's attention, the crew would climb back up into daylight, blinking perhaps against the sudden brightness after the hold's dim shelter, carrying with them the quiet satisfaction of a task completed without incident, a small piece of the ship's future secured a little more firmly by their own careful, patient hands. It is a strange sort of comfort to think of it this way, that somewhere beneath the polished brass and gleaming wood so often admired above, there lay this less celebrated world of barrels and biscuit, of careful counting and quiet vigilance, holding the whole voyage together with far less glamour but certainly no less devotion. And once that hidden arithmetic had been tended to once more, the ship's attention would naturally begin to rise upward again, toward the brighter, more visible signs of her keeping, toward the brass fittings waiting to be polished until they caught the light, and the wood cared for with that same quiet pride which had, only moments before, filled the dim and patient spaces of her hold. So let the mind climb back up out of that dim, biscuit-scented hush, up through the hatch and into the open air again, where the light falls differently across the ship and where the work that waits is no longer about counting what remains below, but about making what remains above look cared for, look loved, look like something worthy of all that hidden labor beneath the deck. There is a kind of unspoken agreement aboard almost any vessel that has been at sea long enough to grow her crew into a family of habit, that the hold may stay dark and its labors invisible, but the decks and rails and fittings will answer in daylight for the ship's honor. And so, once the barrels have been retied and the tallies closed, hands that were busy a little while ago with rope and reckoning turn themselves now toward rag and brush, toward brass and wood, toward the quieter, more visible devotion of keeping a ship that still looks, despite everything the sea has thrown at her, like she is loved. There is something almost meditative in the motion of polishing brass, something that settles the body even as the mind is left free to wander. A sailor kneels or crouches beside a fitting, a bell, a rail cap, a porthole rim, the housing of a lamp, and begins with a cloth dampened just enough to lift the grime without working it deeper into the metal's pores. The rag moves in small circles, patient and unhurried, working at a dullness that seems at first glance permanent, as though the metal had simply decided to surrender its shine for good. Salt air is no friend to brass. It clouds it, greens it faintly at the edges, leaves it looking tired and forgotten after only a few days of neglect. But metal remembers its shine the way a face remembers how to smile. The brightness is buried, not lost, and slowly, beneath the steady friction of cloth and polish, the gray haze begins to lift. A faint gleam appears first at the highest point of the curve, where the rag presses hardest, and then it spreads outward, patch by patch, until the whole fitting seems to wake beneath the sailor's hand. It is not fast work, nor is it meant to be. It asks for the same motion repeated dozens of times, the arm growing warm with the effort, the shoulder settling into a rhythm that becomes, after a while, almost thoughtless, the kind of thoughtlessness that is really a form of deep attention, the mind drifting even as the hand stays faithful to its small, circular task. There is a pride in this that goes beyond mere appearance, though appearance matters more than landsfolk might ever guess. A ship whose brass catches the sun cleanly, whose railings gleam even beneath gray and indifferent weather, tells anyone who looks upon her, a passing vessel, a harbor official come to inspect her papers, her own crew climbing up blinking from below, that she is a ship still cared for, still disciplined, still bound together by something more than rope and timber alone. It is a message written in polish and elbow grease, legible to anyone who has learned how to read a deck the way others read a face. And for the sailors themselves, there is comfort in it too, a way of marking time and effort against the long, uncertain stretches of waiting that anchor so often imposes. To polish brass is to do something finished, something visibly better at the end than it was at the beginning, and in a life so often shaped by weather and chance and the unpredictable moods of the sea, a small, controllable improvement of that kind can feel like its own quiet blessing. The wood asks for different hands, different tools, though it demands the same patience. Decks are scrubbed with holy stones, flat blocks of sandstone, worn smooth themselves through generations of use, dragged back and forth across the planking in long, steady strokes. Sailors kneel or crouch, sometimes for what feels like the whole length of a morning, working the stone across the grain until the wood pales beneath it, losing its gray, weathered look and returning, however briefly, to something closer to its original color, as though the years were being coaxed backward a little at a time. Salt deposits, left behind by spray and slow evaporation, form a thin white crust in the low places between planks, and this too must be scraped away and rinsed clean, lest it work itself deeper into the wood's fibers and hasten the decay that the sea is always, patiently, trying to bring about. There is a particular sound to this work, the soft grinding hush of stone against wood, the slosh of water thrown down to carry away the loosened grime, the light thud of knees shifting their weight from one plank to the next, a sound that becomes, over the length of a long voyage, as familiar and unremarkable as breathing itself. And yet, if a sailor were to lift his head partway through this work and look at what his hands had already accomplished, he might notice something almost startling, the way sunlight, which had seemed only a moment before to slide indifferently across the whole deck, suddenly catches and holds upon the section just cleaned, as though the wood itself has remembered how to welcome the light after being asked to forget it for so long. It is a small transformation, but a real one, and it happens again and again across the length of a ship being kept, dullness giving way, patch by patch, to a kind of modest brightness, until at last the whole visible surface of the vessel seems to hum faintly with attention, every plank and rail and fitting bearing the quiet evidence of hands that had cared enough to return to it, morning after morning, with brush and stone and rag. Below the more visible woodwork, there were smaller mechanisms too, easily overlooked but essential all the same, hinges on hatches and lockers, the moving parts of blocks and pulleys, the working joints of the ship's many small fittings, and these needed their own quiet, unglamorous checking. A sailor might pause at a hinge in passing, work it back and forth once or twice to feel for stiffness, and if it resisted even slightly, reach for a little oil or grease to ease it before moving on to the next. It was not work that left any gleam behind for admiration, and no one would ever praise a hinge for behaving as it should, but a hinge that seized at the wrong moment, in weather, in darkness, in urgency, could cost far more than any amount of dulled brass ever would, and so this too became part of the morning's quiet devotion, not merely making things shine, but making certain that things moved as they ought, cleanly and without complaint, ready to answer whatever sudden demand might later be placed upon them. There was, naturally, some difference in how strictly all this was kept, depending on the nature of the vessel and the temperament of those who commanded her. A naval ship, especially one under the eye of an exacting captain, might hold her crew to a standard of cleanliness that bordered on ceremony, brass polished not merely until it shone, but until it dazzled, decks scrubbed not merely until they were clean, but until they were pale as bone, every rope coiled just so, every surface inspected as though for a visiting admiral who might, in truth, never actually come. Merchant vessels, driven more by economy than by ceremony, often kept a slightly gentler standard, clean enough to preserve the wood and metal from decay, tidy enough to reflect a competent and capable crew, but without quite that same theater of perfection playing out across every surface. And private vessels, smaller craft kept by individual owners or small partnerships, might vary enormously depending on the pride or the lack of it that their owners took in appearances. Some kept as brightly as any naval yacht, gleaming almost defiantly in harbor, while others were left to weather more freely, their brass allowed to soften into a duller, more lived-in patina that certain owners came, in time, to prefer, finding in it a kind of honest character, rather than any failure of care. But whatever the standard held by a particular ship, the underlying logic remained much the same wherever one looked. Cleanliness was never only about appearance, Though appearance mattered a great deal more than it might first seem, it was also, quietly and constantly, a matter of preservation. Salt left unchecked corroded metal and dulled wood, hastening the slow decay that the sea worked patiently upon every vessel from the very moment she first touched water. Regular cleaning slowed this decay, protecting the ship's long-term worth even as it improved her daily appearance in the eyes of anyone who happened to look her way. In this sense, the meditative motions of rag and brush were never purely aesthetic. They were also a form of quiet, unglamorous maintenance, the kind of care that added up, unseen over months and years, into a ship that lasted longer, sailed better, and held her value more securely than one left to weather unattended and unloved. There was, too, something steadying for the crew themselves in all this repetitive, careful work. A ship at anchor could otherwise feel suspended in a strange kind of limbo, not sailing, not quite resting, caught in the peculiar stillness of waiting for wind, for orders, for tide, for whatever it was that would eventually set her moving again. The daily rituals of cleaning gave shape to that stillness, filled the idle hours with purpose, and offered each sailor something finished to point to at day's end, however small that thing might be. A newly gleaming bell, a stretch of pale, holy-stoned deck, a hinge that no longer complained when asked to move. These were modest accomplishments, but real ones, and in their modest reality, they helped hold a crew's morale together in ways that might otherwise have gone entirely unnoticed. Discipline, after all, is often built less from grand gestures than from small, repeated attentions faithfully kept, and a ship whose crew still bothered to polish her brass and scrub her decks, even in the dullest hours of waiting at anchor, was a ship whose crew still cared, still held themselves to a standard, still believed, in some quiet and unspoken way, that the vessel beneath their feet deserved that care. There is something almost tender, thinking of it now, in imagining a sailor kneeling over a section of deck long after the initial urgency of arrival has faded, working the same slow strokes across the same stretch of wood, not because anyone is watching, not because any inspection looms overhead, but simply because the wood asked for it, and because there was, in that quiet, repetitive motion, a kind of peace not easily found anywhere else aboard a working ship. The rhythm of the labor settles into the body, knees against planking, arms sweeping back and forth, shoulder loosening gradually into its task, and the mind, freed from any need for constant vigilance, is allowed to wander gently, perhaps toward home, perhaps toward nothing in particular at all, resting in that particular stillness that comes only from hands occupied and a heart left for the moment untroubled. And when at last the light begins to catch properly on a railing that had only an hour before looked tired and salt-dulled and half-forgotten, there is a small, private satisfaction in it, not loud, not celebrated, but real all the same, felt quietly in the chest rather than announced to anyone nearby. The ship, brightened patch by patch through such patient labor, seems almost to straighten herself beneath the care given her, to sit a little more proudly at her anchorage, as though she too recognized in some wordless way that ships perhaps do possess, that she was still being tended, still being kept, still worth the trouble of all that quiet rag and stone and polish. But a ship's keeping was never only a matter of brass and timber, however much those visible surfaces caught the eye and held the pride of a well-run vessel steady in a harbor full of watching eyes. Beneath the gleam of the fittings and the pale, clean sweep of the decks, there was another, quieter form of care being carried out as well, one that touched not the ship's body, but the bodies of those who lived within her, in the mending of shirts and the darning of stockings, in needle and thread and the small, unglamorous domestic patience of a life lived so very far from any ordinary hearth. So it is, in the hush that follows the last polishing rag being folded away and the brass left to hold its borrowed sunlight a little longer, that the ship's true keeping continues in a smaller, softer register, one that has nothing to do with shine at all. If the deck and the fittings speak of pride held outward toward the harbor and the eyes that might be watching from other hulls, then this next work speaks inward, toward the body, toward comfort, toward the plain fact that a person cannot sail far, or work hard, or sleep well in a shirt whose seams are giving way at the shoulder, or in stockings gone thin as breath at the heel. Anchorage, in this sense, is not only a pause for the vessel, but a pause for the people within her, a chance to turn attention from ropes and timber to something closer still, the cloth against the skin, the small failures of fabric that accumulate quietly during weeks of hard use and go unmended until there is, at last, the stillness to attend to them. It begins often with someone simply sitting down. There is no ceremony to it, no announcement of intention. A sailor settles onto an upturned barrel or a coil of spare rope with a shirt draped over one knee, turns it inside out with the unthinking ease of long habit, and begins to search the seams the way one might search a familiar face for a change in mood. A little strain here, a slight give there, the faint fray along a cuff where the fabric has rubbed for months against wood and rope and salt air. Sometimes another crewman drifts near, not quite meaning to watch, and settles instead into a slow conversation about nothing in particular. The wind that morning, a dream half remembered, some small grievance about the last port, while the needle continues its patient work beneath the talk, moving in and out with a rhythm that seems to steady the voice speaking above it. There is something in the motion of stitching that invites low, unhurried talk, the kind that asks for no urgent answer, only presence, only the comfort of another body nearby doing something equally quiet. The materials themselves are humble enough, a housewife, as such a small mending kit might be called in some periods and traditions, holding needles of different weights, a stub or two of beeswax to draw the thread through smoothly, a handful of buttons collected and hoarded against the day one goes missing at an inconvenient hour, and thread in whatever colors happen to be available, which is to say, usually, whatever color is available at all. Matching is a luxury rarely indulged. A shirt might carry 3 different shades of mended thread by the end of a long voyage, each one marking a small chapter of wear and repair, so that the garment itself becomes something like a modest, wearable record of the months spent at sea, legible only to the person who lived inside it, and perhaps, faintly, to whoever helped mend it. Trousers receive their own particular attention, for they suffer in their own particular ways, the knees worn thin from crouching over rope work or kneeling on deck to scrub or caulk, the seat thinned by hours spent astride a yard or perched on a hard bench during some long watch. A skilled hand reinforces these weak places before they become holes, setting a patch from the inside so that from without the garment still looks whole, still looks respectable enough for the eyes of an officer or a visiting merchant, even if within it tells a plainer truth of long service and careful thrift. There is a particular satisfaction, quiet and unremarked, in catching a tear before it widens, in feeling under one's fingers the difference between fabric merely worn and fabric truly failing, and knowing from long practice exactly which stitch will hold and which will not. It is a small, private kind of foresight, the sort that never gets spoken of but is trusted all the same. Stockings, too, ask for their turn, and here the darning takes on its own small discipline, almost geometric in its patience, the crisscross of thread laid carefully over a heel or a toe worn through, woven tight enough to bear the weight of a boot and the endless friction of deck and rope, yet supple enough not to blister the foot beneath it. A darning egg, if one is aboard, or failing that, a smooth stone or a curved bit of wood pressed into service instead, gives the sock its shape while the needle does its slow weaving, in and out, back and forth, building a small patch of new fabric out of nothing but thread and steady hands. It is not fast work, and it is easy, in the doing of it, to lose track of time altogether, the mind drifting somewhere between the motion of the needle and the murmur of the ship settling gently at her anchorage, rocking so slightly that after a while the body stops noticing the movement at all and simply moves with it, the way one stops hearing a clock after living beside it long enough. Then there are the oilskins, or whatever the period's equivalent of weather gear might be, heavier, sturdier garments meant to turn away rain and spray, and therefore demanding their own kind of attention, since a small failure in their surface is not merely inconvenient, but can mean a soaked, chilled misery on the next wet watch. These are inspected for cracks, for seams gone brittle, for the dulling and thinning of whatever coating or treatment kept them waterproof in the first place, and mended or retreated as materials and knowledge of the time allow, sometimes with wax, sometimes with oil worked carefully back into the fabric by hand, the smell of it lingering afterward on the fingers for hours, faint and not unpleasant, a little like the smell of the sea itself distilled down into something one could hold. There is a practical tenderness in this work, an acknowledgement, unspoken but understood by everyone doing it, that keeping the body dry and warm is not a small matter at sea, however plain and unglamorous the labor of achieving it might look from the outside to anyone who has never spent a night soaked through on watch. It would be a mistake, though, to imagine this domestic work as confined entirely to the ship herself, carried out only by the hands of those aboard. The truth, more often, is wider and more interesting than that, a network reaching back to the shore, to the ports the ship has left and the ports she is bound for, made up of tailors and seamstresses, of chandlers who stock the needles and thread and spare buttons a crew might need, of laundresses and menders who take in garments during a stay in harbor and return them cleaned and repaired for a fair price, sometimes better repaired than any sailor could manage alone with a needle and an unsteady hand. In certain ports, women played a visible and necessary part in this wider labor of keeping sailors clothed and comfortable, running boarding houses where washing and mending were part of the arrangement, keeping small shops that supplied thread and cloth and buttons to any crew willing to pay, or simply taking in piecework from ships at anchor, garments passed down in baskets over the rail and returned days later, folded and whole again, smelling faintly of someone else's hearth and soap. It is worth remembering, gently and without insisting on more certainty than the evidence allows, that the labor of the sea has never belonged only to those who sailed upon it. It reached backward into households and workshops ashore, into hands that never once felt a deck move beneath them, yet were nonetheless bound up, quietly and constantly, in what it took to keep a ship's people fed, clothed, and functioning through one voyage after another. Aboard the vessel herself, though, especially during a longer stay at anchor when shore leave might be limited or costly or simply inconvenient to arrange for everyone at once, the crew largely depended on their own hands and whatever skill they had managed to acquire, whether taught by a mother or a grandmother long before they ever smelled salt water, or picked up more roughly from an older shipmate who had, in turn, learned the same lessons from someone before him. There was no particular shame attached to a man being good with a needle. If anything, it was regarded in most crews and most periods as simply another useful skill, no more remarkable than being able to splice a rope well or tie a proper knot in the dark. Some hands, in fact, became known for it, sought out quietly by others less confident with thread, trading a mended shirt for some other small favor, a share of tobacco perhaps, or a turn taken at some unpleasant task, the ordinary, unspoken economy of shipboard life finding its way even into something as small and personal as the mending of clothes, the same way it found its way into everything else aboard. There is, too, a kind of comfort in the repetitiveness of it, a comfort easy to overlook if one only imagines the sea in terms of storm and distance and grand event, sitting with a needle, working thread through worn fabric, hearing the murmur of other voices nearby doing much the same thing, watching the light shift slowly across the deck as the afternoon wears on. These are not dramatic moments, and they were never meant to be remembered as such, yet they made up a great deal of the actual texture of life at anchor, far more of it in sheer hours than any storm or chase or battle ever did. The mending of a shirt is a small thing, certainly, set against the vastness of an ocean or the weight of a ship's history, but it is also, in its own quiet way, an act of care for the body that must go on working and sleeping and standing watch in that garment, care extended not loudly but steadily, stitch by stitch, until the shirt is whole again and can be folded away, ready for whatever the next stretch of the voyage might ask of it. And beneath all of it, though rarely spoken aloud, there runs a certain gratitude toward the shirt that has lasted another season because someone troubled to mend it, toward the stocking that will keep a foot dry a little longer, toward the oilskin that will turn away one more soaking that might otherwise have settled into the chest as a cough or worse. In a life so often at the mercy of forces far beyond any single person's control, wind, tide, weather, the slow turning of the calendar toward departure, there is something steadying in tending to the things that can be tended, in exercising over cloth and thread at least a kind of quiet mastery that the sea itself will never allow over anything larger. It is domestic work, yes, unremarkable and repetitive, closer to a hearth than to any legend of the sea, and yet it belongs to the story of a ship at anchor every bit as much as her polished brass or her carefully coiled rope, because it is, in the end, a story about people, about hands finding small ways to make a hard life a little more bearable, one patch, one stitch, one darned heel at a time, quietly, without needing anyone to notice. When the mending is finally set aside for the evening, folded and stowed until it is needed again, the needles wiped clean and tucked back into their small housewife, the buttons returned to whatever tin or pouch kept them safe from loss, the crew's attention begins, almost without anyone deciding it should, to drift outward once more, away from the small, close work of thread and cloth, toward the water beyond the rail, toward the small boats moving between anchored ships and the shore, toward whatever news, letters, or trade might be making its way across the harbor even now, carried by hands and voices belonging to that wider dockside world waiting just beyond the ship's quiet decks. So the needles rest now, and the mending sleeps in its basket a little longer, tucked away until it is needed again, and the quiet that settles over the deck in that moment is not an ending, but a kind of doorway, because a ship at anchor is never truly alone with herself for long. Beyond the rail, the harbor has been going about its own patient business all this while, indifferent to whether anyone aboard was darning stockings or coiling rope. And now that the small, close work of the evening has folded itself away, the crew's eyes lift naturally toward that wider water, toward the little boats that have been threading between hull and shore since before the sun was fully up, carrying in their bellies everything a ship cannot make or grow or mend for herself. It helps, perhaps, to think of the anchored vessel as something suspended between two lives, neither fully a creature of the sea nor fully a citizen of the land, but a kind of go-between, tethered by her cable to the seabed and by 100 looser threads to the docks. She cannot feed herself, she cannot post her own letters, nor argue her own customs papers, nor barter for the extra keg of salt pork that the purser has decided, after some private arithmetic, that the coming weeks will require. For all of that, she depends on other hands entirely, hands belonging to a whole unseen community of the harbor, whose quiet business it is to keep ships like hers fit to leave when the tide and the weather finally agree to allow it. And among the first of these arrivals, often before the ship's own people have finished their morning rounds, is the pilot or word of the pilot, for in a crowded anchorage the pilot's boat is a familiar shape long before it draws alongside. He comes not to sell anything, but to lend a kind of borrowed knowledge, the particular temper of this channel, the sandbar that has shifted since last season, the current that runs deceptively strong past the point where the light stands watch over the harbor mouth. His visit, when it comes, is brief and businesslike, a few words exchanged with the master, a chart perhaps unrolled and traced with a blunt, weathered finger, and then he is gone again, off toward some other hull waiting its turn for the same quiet reassurance. It is said in some ports that a good pilot never speaks more than he must, as though the channel's secrets were coin best spent sparingly. Whether that is true everywhere, or simply a comfortable story sailors like to tell about the men who guide them safely past danger, no one aboard could say for certain, and perhaps it hardly matters, so long as the ship clears the bar without incident. Behind the pilot's boat, in no particular order, come the tradesmen of the water, the chandler's boy first, most likely, balancing a small crate of candles and cordage and the odd bottle of lamp oil, calling up to ask what the ship still lacks before the chandler himself troubles to come out and haggle over it properly. There is a certain theater to this haggling, a back and forth that both sides seem to enjoy more than the actual sum eventually agreed upon would suggest, as though the negotiation itself were part of what was being purchased, along with the rope and the oil. The cooper follows soon after, or sends his apprentice in his place to inspect the barrels already aboard for any looseness in the staves, tapping each one with a practiced knuckle the way a physician might tap a patient's chest, listening for a hollowness that would mean trouble far out at sea, well past the reach of any dockside remedy. A stave sprung mid-ocean is no small matter, after all, and so this tapping, this brief percussion up and down the row of barrels, is taken quite seriously, even though from the rail it looks almost playful, like a child running a stick along a fence just to hear the sound it makes. The porters come next, or perhaps alongside, their boats sitting low in the water under the weight of sacks and crates, and now and then some live creature bound for a galley pen, and there is a particular rhythm to the loading and unloading that anyone who has watched it more than once begins to recognize. The shout from below, the answering call from the deck, the creak of the tackle, the soft thud of goods finding their place in the hold. It is not graceful work, not in the way the ship's own rigging can seem graceful when the wind fills it just so, but it has its own kind of order, an order built from repetition and long familiarity, the same crates handled by the same hands in roughly the same way morning after morning, until the whole business takes on something almost like music, if music can be made of rope and grunting and the occasional dropped sack of meal, and the laughter that follows such a mishap more often than any anger. Somewhere in the midst of all this arrives the customs officer, and his presence changes the tenor of the deck ever so slightly, the way a schoolroom quiets when the master steps back in after stepping briefly out. He is not unkind, usually, but he is thorough, or is meant to be, examining the ship's papers, comparing manifests against what he can see with his own eyes, occasionally requesting that a barrel be opened or a sack untied so that he might sample what it claims to hold. A pinch of tobacco rubbed between the fingers and smelled, a taste of grain taken from the top of a sack, a splash of wine poured into a small cup and held to the light before it is tasted and, more often than not, approved. These small rituals of inspection are as much a part of a ship's readiness as any knot or splice, though they belong to paper and ink rather than rope and canvas. The master signs where he is told to sign, and the officer signs where the master is told to expect his signature, and in this quiet exchange of ink the ship's right to carry her cargo onward, or to have taken it on in the first place, is confirmed, at least on paper, which in the world of harbors and customs houses is very often treated as the same thing as confirming it in fact. And then, of course, there is the mail, which arrives with far less ceremony than the customs officer, but is welcomed, if anything, more warmly still. A small boat rows out from the shore carrying a satchel or two, and the messenger calls up the ship's name, and if there is anything for her, it is passed up hand to hand, sometimes still damp from the spray, sometimes tied with string that has clearly been retied more than once along its long journey to find her. Letters from home, letters from other ports, letters that have been waiting weeks or months for a ship to happen to be lying at anchor in the right harbor at the right time. These are handed out below decks with a particular hush, a kind of respect, because everyone aboard knows what it is to wait for word, and knows, too, what it is to receive none. And so even those without a letter of their own tend to watch the distribution with a quiet, careful attention, glad for whoever's name is called, even when it is not their own name being spoken. Along with the mail comes news, though news at the dockside is a slippery thing, arriving in fragments half remembered, retold from mouth to mouth until it is hard to say where the fact ends and the embellishment quietly begins. A ship lost somewhere along the coast, though no one quite agrees where. A price for sugar that has doubled, or perhaps only risen a little, depending on who is telling it and how recently they last spoke to someone who actually sells sugar for a living. A war rumored to have started or ended, or perhaps never quite happened in the way the story insists. These things travel the harbor the way gulls travel the sky, circling, landing, taking off again, never quite settling long enough to be pinned down as certain. Sailors, being practical people for the most part, learn early to hold such news loosely, to nod and thank the teller, and privately reserve judgment until something more solid comes along, though that does not stop the stories from being enjoyed in the meantime, over a shared pipe or a mug passed hand to hand along the rail. The water sellers move through all of this too, their small craft heavy with casks of fresh water rowed out from some spring or well ashore, since a harbor's own water, close in among so many hulls, is rarely fit to drink, however calm and inviting it might look from the deck. Their calls are among the most constant sounds of the anchorage, a kind of background hum beneath the louder business of trade and news, and the exchange of coin for water is usually brief and unremarkable, though on some ships it is said, and here again it is only said, not proven, that a coin is kept back deliberately from every such purchase and dropped instead into the water itself, an offering of sorts, meant to keep the harbor generous and the anchorage safe through the nights ahead. Whether this custom is truly old or a habit picked up more recently and dressed up afterward in the comfortable language of tradition, no one aboard could say with any confidence. It is simply a thing some sailors do, quietly, almost without thinking, the way one might touch wood or step carefully around another's outstretched legs, more from a kind of gentle caution than from any firm or spoken belief. Other stories drift through the anchorage in much the same uncertain way. Talk of lights seen moving low over the water on certain still nights, lights that some claim to be lanterns from small boats about ordinary business, and others insist are something stranger, tied to ships lost long ago in that same stretch of water, still somehow impossibly making their rounds. It is the kind of tale that seems to belong to every old harbor in one form or another, told with slight variations depending on who is doing the telling and how far the pipe smoke has drifted, and it is impossible now to say whether it began as an honest sighting, a trick of mist and lantern light, or simply a story invented long ago to keep young sailors properly wary of drifting too far from the ship after dark. Told softly over a shared pipe as the light fails and the last boats pull for shore, it asks for nothing more than to be listened to, not necessarily believed, and there is a kind of comfort in that undemanding arrangement, story and listener asking so little of one another. Through all this coming and going, the ship herself sits patiently at the center of it, gathering what she needs a little at a time, water settling in her casks, letters tucked away in her master's cabin, ink drying on papers destined for the customs house ashore, news half believed and half doubted passed from hand to hand along her decks like a warm cup on a cold watch. She takes in the harbor's business the way she might take in the tide, without visible effort, simply by being where she is, moored in the particular kind of stillness that belongs only to a vessel waiting, not idle exactly, but paused, gathering herself for whatever comes after the anchor is finally raised and the harbor falls away behind her, and as the small boats begin, one by one, to pull away again toward the shore, their errands finished for the day, oars dipping in that easy rhythm of men glad to be heading home before dark, there is a sense, quiet, unspoken, but felt all the same by everyone still aboard, that the harbor's part in the ship's readiness is drawing toward its close, and that soon enough attention will turn back to the ship alone, to her own decks and her own crew, as they begin in their own good time the final small rounds that will carry her at last back out toward open water. So the boats go, and the harbor exhales a little as they go, and the ship left behind seems to feel that exhale too, settling deeper into her own stillness for just a little while longer, as though gathering breath before the next thing asks itself of her. There is a particular hush that comes over a vessel in these last hours before departure, different from the hush of full anchor rest, though it grows out of that same quiet, a hush with attention folded inside it, the way a held breath is still breath, only waiting for its moment to be let go. The crew feel it before they could say what it is, a certain straightening of shoulders, a certain listening in the ears that had for days grown used to the soft language of harbor sounds, bumboats and gulls and distant church bells marking hours that meant little beyond marking them. Now the listening turns outward again, toward wind and sky and the small telling signs that say a passage might soon be possible, might soon be wise, might soon simply be time. It begins, as so much aboard a ship begins, with looking. Not urgent looking, not yet, but the deliberate kind, a slow walking of decks by men who already know every inch of them, checking again what they checked days before, because a ship readying for sea forgives no assumption twice made. Lines are followed hand over hand from cleat to block to yard, testing for any softness that fatigue might have worked into fiber while no one was watching. Canvas already mended is unfurled a little, just enough to see daylight through it, just enough to be sure the small neat stitches of morning's careful hands have held as promised. Nothing dramatic happens in this looking. It is the same quiet vigilance that has moved through the ship since she first came to anchor, only now it carries a different weight, because soon there will be no harbor close by to forgive a fault discovered too late. A man pauses at a block, turns it once with his thumb, listens for the small complaint a dry sheave makes, and moves on satisfied, or does not move on at all until the complaint is answered with a little oil and a little patience. Fresh water comes aboard in these final hours too, casks rolled up from the boats with the particular grunt and care water always demands, being heavier and more essential than most cargo a ship will ever carry. It is measured as it goes, the way flour and salt beef were measured days before, because water is time at sea. Water is how many days a crew may safely reckon on before land must be found again, whether by chart or by fortune. The casks are stowed low, near the ship's center line, where their weight will steady rather than trouble her, and there is something almost ceremonial in watching them settle into place, as though the ship herself were quietly nodding, "Yes, this will do. This is enough to go on with." A vessel provisioned is a vessel with permission to leave, and everyone aboard seems to sense the shift in her posture as the last cask finds its home, the deck creaking once beneath the new weight and then falling silent again, as if the matter were settled and needed no further comment. The anchor gear, too, receives its own last attention, though this is handled with a kind of respect close to caution, for an anchor mishandled at the moment of departure can undo in an instant all the patient stillness of days spent doing everything properly. Cable is inspected link by link where it can be reached, checked for the telltale rust bloom or worn shackle pin that might turn a routine weighing into an afternoon's trouble. The windlass is worked by hand, slow turns to loosen what harbor stillness may have stiffened, oiled where oiling helps, and left ready, poised, one might say, the way a runner rests on the balls of their feet rather than their heels, weight already leaning toward the next motion. No one hurries this. Rushing an anchor's readiness has undone finer ships than this one, or so the old stories go, and every man aboard who has spent even a single hard season at sea carries some tale, half his own and half borrowed from an older sailor's telling, of what happens when care is skipped for the sake of haste. Whether every such tale is entirely true hardly matters. What matters is the caution it teaches, passed down the way most seafaring wisdom is passed down, quietly, through repetition rather than instruction. And it is here, in these final rounds, that the watches begin to reassemble themselves into something sharper than the loose harbor rhythm the crew has known these recent days. Names are called, or simply understood without needing to be called, for men who have sailed together long enough develop their own quiet shorthand for who stands where and when. The bright, easy overlap of harbor days, when idle hands might drift toward mending or talk or simply watching gulls wheel over the water, narrows now into clearer lines. Someone will have the deck when the anchor comes up. Someone will be at the helm before the sails are even drawing wind, hands already feeling for a rudder that has sat unused and silent for days, testing its answer the way one might test an old friend's mood after a long parting. The ship's rhythm, which had loosened at anchor the way a hand loosens after gripping something tightly for too long, begins now to close again into readiness, finger by finger, until it is a fist once more, not clenched in anxiety, but simply prepared, the way any capable hand prepares itself before reaching for real work. It would be easy, hearing all this, to imagine that the days spent at anchor were merely an interruption to the ship's true purpose, a pause before the real business of sailing resumed. But that is not quite how it sits, not if you watch closely enough, not if you let yourself follow the quiet thread running beneath everything that has happened since she first came to anchor in this harbor. The mending of rope and canvas, the careful arithmetic of stores, the polishing of brass and the sweeping of decks, the small domestic stitching of shirts and stockings, even the trading of news and letters with passing boats, none of it was separate from sailing. All of it was sailing, in its quieter clothing. A ship does not become capable of a passage only when her sails fill with wind. She becomes capable of it in the long accumulation of small, patient hours when nothing seems to be happening at all, except that everything necessary is being made ready, checked, repaired, restocked, and understood again by hands that must trust it absolutely once the land falls away. This is, perhaps, one of the oldest and least dramatic truths of the sea, so old that it rarely finds its way into the stories told about ships, which tend to favor storms and daring and narrow escapes over anchors and stitching and slow, measured mornings. And yet those quieter chapters are the foundation the dramatic ones stand upon. A crew does not survive a storm because they are brave in the moment the storm arrives. They survive it because the rigging was checked calmly on an ordinary morning weeks before, because the stores were measured honestly, because the anchor gear was oiled and inspected without hurry when there was no danger at all, only the discipline of doing a small thing correctly simply because it was the right time to do it. Competence, the kind that steadies a ship and her crew when real trouble comes, is built almost entirely out of repetition, the same rounds walked again and again, the same checks made until they become as natural as breathing, until a sailor's hands know a fault by feel before his mind has even finished naming it. There is comfort in this if you let yourself sit with it a while. The world often wants to celebrate only the striking moments, the departure under full sail, the safe arrival after a hard crossing, the dramatic turn of fortune at sea, and forgets the long, quiet stretches in between, the maintenance and the waiting, and the small, unglamorous labor of getting ready. But those stretches are not empty time. They are where the real strength is made, slowly, without much notice, the way a rope gains its strength not in some single dramatic pull, but in the steady, patient laying of many small fibers twisted together long before anyone ever asks it to bear weight. A harbor stay like this one, with its inspections and its stitching and its careful stores and its passing news, is simply life practicing itself in miniature, rehearsing the same instincts that will matter enormously later, in conditions when there will be no time left for rehearsal at all. As the light begins its long, slow fade toward evening, the ship stands nearly complete again in her readiness, the way she must have stood once before, and the way she will stand again after her next arrival and her next departure, in a cycle so old it has worn its own smooth path through the lives of everyone who has ever served aboard her. Arrival and the loosening of tension as anchor finds bottom, the long, patient middle of maintenance and waiting, filled with small, honest labor easy to overlook. Preparation, quickening again as departure nears, and then departure itself when all that quiet, unseen work finally shows its worth in the confident way sails fill and a hull answers the sea. It is not a straight line from one port to another, not really. It is more like a wheel, turning the same way each time, teaching the same lessons each time, asking the same patience each time, and finding each time a crew a little more sure of themselves for having done it all before, even if none of them could quite say when the sureness had settled into them. Tonight, though, none of that lies far ahead yet. Tonight the ship simply rests, complete for the moment, water settled in her casks, gear readied and waiting by the windlass, watches quietly assigned and understood, decks swept clean beneath a sky beginning to dim toward the soft colors evening brings to harbors the world over. She holds steady at her anchor, patient, unhurried, neither longing for the wind nor fearing its absence, simply present in the particular stillness of a vessel that has done what needed doing and now waits, as ships have always waited, for the next useful breath of air to carry her onward. There is no impatience in this waiting, only a kind of readiness worn easily, the way a well-fitted coat is worn without thought once it has been broken in by use. And perhaps that is enough of the story for tonight as well. Enough watching, enough quiet labor followed alongside her, enough gentle drifting from task to task and hour to hour, leaving her there in the softening light, steady and ready, while your own thoughts settle the way her water has settled, and rest finds you the way it finds any harbor at the closing of a long, quiet day.